Greetings and welcome to another Educator Innovator webinar. It's September 30th, 2014, and today we're discussing the latest digital media and learning competition, the Trust Challenge. I'm your host, Paul O, and I'm joining the webinar from the National Writing Project offices in Berkeley, California. Today our guest is Sheryl Grant, Director of Social Networking for HASTAC and the Digital Media and Learning Competition. But let's let Sheryl introduce herself. Hi, Sheryl.
Hi, thank you, Paul. Hi, everybody. Thank you. I am the Director of Social Networking, and I do a lot of the webinars, so if people have been joining us in some of our past ones, that was me. I work at HASTAC, but we're co-located. Half of us, our team is at Duke, and half is at University of California, Irvine. And we're right deep into our fifth Open International Competition, which is our Trust Challenge, Building Trust in Connected Learning Environments. And so this is a little bit different for us. We decided this year that we were going to go and directly reach out to communities that we know have a lot of people thinking about connected learning and some of the issues and intellectual framing of our competition that people are very comfortable and familiar with. And so this is the first time that we've reached out and done one where I'm actually the guest instead of the moderator. So I just want to make one comment that if you are applying to the competition and you're combing through the FAQ or the terms or anything on the competition, and if for some reason I end up today saying something that there's a discrepancy between what is on the website and what I have said, whatever's on the website is the official document, so it overrides anything that I might say in case I give an answer to somebody's question that is misinterpreting. Sometimes we do our terms and conditions change every year, so I'm just giving a caveat just in case I make a mistake.
Great. Thanks, Sheryl, and it's such a pleasure to have you on this webinar, and it's great to see you on the other side of the microphone here. So before we get started, I just wanted to mention to the audience that if you are watching this Hangout from the Educator Innovator blog page, we encourage you to jump into the chat that is right next to the video window, and please engage in conversation and post any questions. If you have questions, we'll bring them into the webinar here. So let's jump into this. I'm sure lots of people are eager to hear your thinking about the Trust Challenge, Sheryl. So the first question that I have for you is, the Trust Challenge is referred to as a response to a call to action. Can you tell us what that signifies?
Yeah, I always tell people that the best place, I know when I apply to grants, I've been on both sides. When I apply to grants, I like to know sort of the intellectual, where is the foundation or where is the organization coming from, and if people are not familiar, the Digital Media and Learning Competition, which is the entity that MacArthur supports and HASTAC administers. If people are familiar with MacArthur Foundation, they're going to know connected learning is a big part of the bigger initiative. And so MacArthur also worked with the Aspen Institute, the Aspen Task Force, which is a document that I would encourage everybody who's applying to look through. It's also a very wonderfully organized document. Their site did a nice job of sort of chunking it out and making it easy. And I've shared a link about the findings and recommendations. And we are called the Trust Challenge. There are other chapters. I think there's 4 other chapters: access, digital literacies, interoperability, and trust networks. And they really all fit together under the theme of trust. And so I encourage everybody to take a look at that report and just look at the findings and recommendations just to sort of get a sense of what this is a response to. So we're hoping to seed an ecosystem that is filled with innovations on these connected learning environments, building trust so that people can move ahead the agenda that came forward in the findings and recommendations. And really what that's about, just to summarize the report very briefly, is that we know that educators, particularly with your organization, but educators are very learner-centered, but educational systems are not necessarily that way. And so we want to make sure that we are innovating learning experiences, especially ones that are happening outside the traditional structure of education or are somehow doing things in this space that looks at the network as a seamless ecosystem, but the institutional policies or pieces of it are not necessarily so. And so it's really a response to the call to action that they issued when they released the report, to get people thinking about where are these points of pain, what are some innovations that can make it so that it truly is a learner-centered ecosystem for everybody involved, for the institutions, the policies, the legal parts of it. And so that's the report that I would say if people are going to read something. That's the foundational document that I think is important people understand for context.
Great, thanks, Sheryl. And I should just add that we I think, crafted a blog post at Educator Innovator that links as well to the Aspen Institute report. And so people are on our site, they can definitely search for that amongst our blogs. So the call for proposals for the Trust Challenge mentions laboratories. Can you unpack that term for us?
Yes, that's a good question. So when we use laboratories, we're talking about, we're really coming from the perspective that networked learning is about creating a seamless system, and a system involves other institutions or other partnerships, or even just the idea of trust usually assumes that there's going to be something else. So a laboratory is really just intended to describe a place where you're going to pilot this idea, or you're going to implement the idea or the innovation and be able to experiment and see how it's going to work when it's actually live. And so the laboratory is sort of a loose, it's not the coming together of a long-term entity. It's really being used in sort of the creative sense of the word, that we want people to come together and create an example, really. And I know I've talked to people before about, does this mean that I as an individual can apply? And it's a little bit tricky because there are grant requirements. So for example, for an individual to apply, they have to have an institutional affiliation just for legal reasons. And so you have to at least be affiliated with an institution. And but you do not necessarily have to have partners. So your laboratory could be something that's within your organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be multiple organizations, although we recognize that a trust environment that involves multiple organizations is probably going to have a lot of moving parts, and there will be some interesting challenges there. So the laboratory is really intended to signify this idea that it's a little bit of both. It can be an institution, and you're solving or coming up with your solution just within your organization, or it can be with multiple organizations.
Great, thanks, Sheryl. And I had a question as well in relation to the laboratories. You have talked about interoperability, and I'm wondering if you could just give a little more context for what you mean by interoperability.
Yeah, interoperability almost made people on my team cry when we had to try and define it. It's really a tough word to describe, and unfortunately, a couple weeks ago we had David Theo Goldberg and Kathy Casserly do a webinar about this, and I have a link for you that I can share. My colleague Jade Davis put together a SoundCloud, which is this great tool where you can annotate, and so people can look at the comments on this webinar and they can jump ahead to see what all the questions were. And one of them was asking Kathy Casserly, who is a fellow with the Aspen Institute, about interoperability. And she's also the former president at Creative Commons, so she's a great person to ask this question. So she does a much better job than I'm going to do right now. But one of the things I do remember that she said is that interoperability does not necessarily mean just technical. It can also be the human systems, the legal, the policy, and it's really the idea that we are going for a seamless system. We're going for the true definition of network learning. So all of the affordances that are possible that tend to not be so easy because of legacy policies and legacy maybe technologies. It's really the idea of making sure that it truly is a learner-centered system. And so it's multi-layered, and I know a lot of people, I sometimes hear them talk about the railroad system as an idea of interoperability or common currency, and I think most people who work around technology have the idea that there are silos, there are things that don't play well with each other, or if they do play well with each other, they tend to represent third-party proprietary systems that bring a host of other issues that create different kinds of silos. And so it's really the whole nest of issues that goes with interoperability. I know John Palfrey wrote a book called Interop that I found really helpful when I was trying to really get a good deep scope about what we're talking about with interoperability. But it's a big part of the trust conversation. It's not an easy one. It's probably the kind of thing that people working in these areas, when they realize they've hit a wall, recognize this would be great if it wasn't here. So we're really interested in how people are thinking about dealing with interoperability issues that make things better for learners in connected learning environments.
Great, thanks. You've already begun to talk a little bit about some of the resources that applicants can access and leverage. I'm wondering if there are other resources that you'd recommend people reference when drafting their applications.
Yeah, I think on the dmlcompetition.net site, which is our official competition site, there is a resource page. I believe it's called Webinars, and on that page is the SoundCloud recording that I was just referencing. And also we did 4 webinars with Connected Learning TV and just had a lot of power thinkers show up and talk about trust in higher ed environments, trust in connected learning environments. We had one that had a little bit more about interoperability, so there's 4 there. And then we also at the same time are back on HASTAC. We have been collecting the resources that we're generating on HASTAC, and right now we're running a series of interviews with thought leaders, including people like Kathy Davidson and Dana Boyd, asking them to talk about some of these issues and framing them in the perspective of changing the way we teach and learn and trust in these environments. So that's also a nice place to go for a little bit of the framing and the conversations that are starting to be generated by some of these. And then I would also say, you know, sometimes there's a fine line between bringing up examples of what the competition is thinking about and then letting innovators just do that work for us. Sometimes it's hard to think, it's even hard just on our side to come up with great examples, but there are some examples. Sometimes it's nice to see some simple ones, and then it helps people start thinking. I find almost everybody I talk to that's part of the networks, including yours, just naturally are very innovative thinkers, very enterprising, very good at problem solving, and sometimes they just need a couple of examples to get those fires burning. And so what we have on the DML competition site are some examples, and I believe that is what the menu link says, is examples, and there's about 6 different ideas of what we're thinking about. I think if you read the Aspen Task Force report, you see some actual examples that they reference as these are the kinds of things, here are some ideas. So there's more even in the task force about real concrete ones. Ours are just we've really just like invented them in our heads. And then I would also say too, for people who are not familiar with connected learning, one resource that I've really enjoyed, Antero Garcia edited a collection of teachers and their practices of implementing connected learning in their classrooms. And I think for your network in particular, I really appreciated that because I understood the research agenda, I understood a lot of the content that was coming out and people talking about it, but I really found that to be helpful because they touch on a lot of the issues. So for people who are trying to get their minds around connected learning, I liked the concrete example of implementing them in the classroom and hearing from educators how they did that. So that's sort of an outlier resource. It's not really part of the competition, but I think it's a great one for people who are saying, well, what exactly do you mean by connected learning? And there certainly are many more examples. I think the Cities of Learning initiative, citiesoflearning.org, is another issue or another initiative about connected learning with multiple out-of-school networks and schools working together. There's a badge system that runs through that, as well as with the Hive network. So there's different scales of labs, I guess you could say, for thinking about connected learning. It could be right at the classroom level, it could be at the school level, it can be bridging out to the community, it could be multiple partnerships with museums and libraries. And so for people that are finding that concept new, I think there's some great, and of course the Connected Learning Alliance has great resources as well. I think that's probably where I would say are the best resources. And then, of course, I'm going to just, I know people who are probably already familiar with the competition know, but we're at DML Comp on Twitter, we're at HASTAC on Twitter, and then we have the hashtag DML Trust. And those are the best places to get, we always tweet. We are pretty good about getting things up on Facebook and Google Plus and LinkedIn, but Twitter is by far the one that is going to have the most up-to-date and commonly tweeting things out. So that's the best place to follow when new content is posted and events and things like that.
Fantastic. That's a lot of wonderful resources. And my next question actually has to do with something that I've heard people who are considering applying talk about, which is the human element in relation to the technology element for the grant proposals. Will preference be given to proposals that are primarily about technological solutions and innovations, or can they also apply to the human element?
The human element is relevant, absolutely, and I think I'm going to speak just my own opinion is that that's sort of the nature of the word laboratory is a real working laboratory with real learners and real educators and real institutions. So certainly, I think when I look through the Aspen Task Force and I see some of the ideas that they get at, they do have people who are coming up with ideas where the technology is a significant part of their idea. But I think we want to see the human element, and I include, when you say human element, I assume that you also mean things like the legal and the policy and just a lot of the things that we don't necessarily see that are preventing a truly networked learning environment. So yes, the human element is definitely, and one of the parts of this is in the Aspen Task Force as well as in our competition is the social emotional literacies. So all of those pieces are very interesting to us as we take on more and more of the affordances of a network learning environment, connected learning environment. There's also more conversation to be had and more tools and more thinking about how this impacts privacy, how does this impact the way that learners are interacting with each other and what they're saying and how they're saying it and how they're modeling themselves online. So all those pieces are equally relevant. Yeah, so that's a great question. So yes, it does not have to be a strictly technological innovation with sort of human actors as these peripheral parts of the human element is very relevant to this.
That's great to know. And speaking of the human element, the challenge is, I'm wondering in terms of who can participate in the challenge is, can the learners be any age? For example, can teachers be considered learners?
Yes, teachers are excellent learners. They're among our best learners. Yes, you can be any age, and often the DML competition does end up attracting a lot of K-12. That youth serving organizations tend to be a big part of who applies, but this is open to higher ed as well, and teachers are absolutely part of this conversation. So adult learners, if there is a proposal that is about thinking what is going to make this really work for educators, that is absolutely relevant to the competition.
Great, and so perhaps you could help us out with some key dates.
So we're in the open application window right now. The applications are due November 3rd by 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and this is an international open competition. So for those of you, or if you have people in your network who are international, timeanddate.com is great for figuring out what that time would be in your time zone. Public voting is a component of the competition, and public voting is going to begin December 4th. It closes December 19th, and the winners will be announced in January. The public voting means we want people to have a unique URL and to have people come to your application and be able to vote for it. One vote per IP address, which I know is a little bit complicated if you're at a museum or library where there's a shared IP. But it's a voting period where the People's Choice Award will be awarded an additional $5,000 that goes toward the purchase of technology relevant to your programming. And I believe what the website says is that while judges will be very interested to hear what the public thinks, that does not necessarily guarantee becoming a winner of the competition, but it's definitely a time to focus on getting your networks mobilized and excited about your project to get them to vote for it. So that's going to be some pre-holiday excitement in terms of people engaging with the site and each other's applications and things like that.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's exciting to think about that public component and that public participation. So I know, Sheryl, that you mentioned this already, but I think it would probably help our audience to hear again, what are some of the ways in which people can follow the Trust Challenge online?
I think the best way is to follow on Twitter for the most up-to-date announcements. So that's the hashtag DMLTrust, and then hopefully you'll follow DMLComp or HASTAC. We tweet from both. On the DML competition website, we have a blog, and so we cross-post a lot there. The content that's coming out, the building conversations around trust, the ones that I mentioned earlier with Kathy Davidson and Dana Boyd, are also being published on the blog on DML competition. And then the HASTAC Trust Collection is where we are aggregating the conversations that people are having and the different webinars that are coming up. So those are probably the best places. We do have a Facebook presence, DML competition, digital media and learning competition on Facebook, and then LinkedIn as well. And LinkedIn has become a very busy place lately. It sort of surprised me. I thought it was sort of a sleepy backwater for a while, but it's actually become quite an active place for us. So LinkedIn and also Google Plus are the best places to follow us. We do also we have a email address if you had specific questions that you want answered. If you're sitting down with your team and you have a question for the competition directly, the email address is dml@hri.uci.edu. That's the same address for the contact box if you were to go to the website to ask specific questions. So that's a good place to get the official answers. And then in the upcoming month, we're going to be doing more webinars. They'll be less like this. There will most likely be, not most likely, they will be conversations with the two that we do have scheduled. The first one is with Connie Yao, who's the Director of Education, and I'm really looking forward to that because she always frames connected learning and the issues in such great ways. And she's going to be doing the webinar with David Theo Goldberg, who's co-founder of HASTAC, and they are going to be talking about the challenge on October 30th, and I have a link to that event. I believe that's at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be tweeting that out so that people can follow that, and that'll be archived. I will say also, Jade Davis, my colleague, does a great job of editing and making all of this very accessible. I know for me, an hour sometimes is a long time to watch a webinar, and I can usually come in for a little bit, but not for the whole time while I'm at work. And so all of this will be archived. And she also went through the 4 hours of connected learning TV webinars that we did, and she created a highlights reel, and that's also on HASTAC. So that's great just to sort of get your very quick summation of those ones. And then we're also going to be doing 2 other webinars. One is with Maria Teresa Kumar, who's the co-chair of the Aspen Task Force Report, and she'll be joining us October 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I don't have a link yet for that, but that will come out on Twitter once we generate that. And that's going to be also a fantastic conversation as well, because Maria Teresa was very involved in the Aspen Task Force Report, and I've read it and I have been having these conversations for a while, and I just find once you talk to people who are deeply involved, it really gets your imagination going, and even I, who am not applying, I start thinking, oh, I understand better now what this is about and what we're going for. And then the third one that we're going to be doing, I'm very excited about, we'll have practitioners from 2 of the Cities of Learning initiatives, one from Chicago, one from Los Angeles, And we're going to be talking about their experiences with some of the thornier trust challenges on the ground, things to do with data and privacy and trust in these connected learning environments. And we're going to also be having a special guest from the Data Quality Campaign, which is a really interesting site for those of you who have not looked at it before. They give a report card to all of the states in terms of how well they make data accessible, and some of the same issues, some overlapping issues. They're very focused on student achievement, and while that's very important, I would say the trust challenge is looking at a sort of the learning in a much broader sense. But it will be very interesting to hear from their team, from their representatives, just to hear. They've done a lot of work across the country and have a very good idea about how some of these issues are different from state to state. So that's going to be exciting as well, and we're just working on the dates for that, so we'll be tweeting that out as well. So we have lots coming up, and hopefully even if people are not in a position to apply, that they'll become part of the conversation. It's, I think, one of the biggest ones that we have to address going forward if we really want to start moving some of these issues into the type of learning environment that we all want to see for our learners.
Yeah, I agree completely, just from my experiences in the schools. And I'm wondering, before we let you go, Sheryl, a couple of things. One is a logistical question about the webinars at the HASTAC site. Will people need to pre-register for those webinars, or should they just show up? And then
there is a, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please. Yeah.
I was going to say, yes, that you can pre-register if you would like, and that what that does is it just gives you a reminder, which is nice if you're, like to get something by email or text message to remind you, but you do not have to pre-register. It will be something you can drop into. Great,
wonderful. And then my last question just had to do with the fact that you've brought up over the course of this conversation a couple of times cities of learning, and I'm not sure that everyone in our audience is completely familiar with cities of learning, and I realize that in some ways it's somewhat peripheral to this particular challenge, but just to help people out in case they're wondering, what is this Cities of Learning initiative that Sheryl keeps mentioning?
Yeah, that's a great. Thank you for asking that. So citiesoflearning.org is the website, and it started in Chicago. Chicago a couple years ago really was looking at summer drop-off and trying to keep students engaged, and created this. I would say the first step in linking some of the out-of-school programming that happens, the rich programming that happens with museums and libraries and community centers and things like that. And then we got on board in a bigger way with badges. By we, I mean the badging community and the DML Connected Learning community. And so 2 years ago, Cities of Learning badged the whole initiative, and then this year I believe there were 4 or 5 more cities that joined. So Los Angeles, Dallas, Pittsburgh, Washington D.C. I think I'm forgetting one. And so it's a movement. It's a way of looking at this in a much more of a movement, initiative, campaign way of thinking about learning with these, what I think of them as trust networks. And so implementing that, and also implementing badges on top of it. For people who have been following the badges conversation, badges tend to make more explicit some of the implicit relationships, and that raises a lot of negotiations about data and privacy and trust. And so it's an interesting initiative to hear from, particularly with this competition, because they have really moved this idea of a connected learning environment with their own programming and some of the different initiatives. They've really moved it forward in a pretty substantial way. A lot of us are familiar with maybe working within our organization or with one, cities and hives, which I sort of think of as a similar large-scale network. They're really starting to make us think in terms of the learner at the center of these networks in compelling ways, and so it's a great initiative to stay on top of and follow and learn how they're negotiating huge networks. Some of them are over 100 participating organizations, so it's exciting, and they're working with the school district, so it's in school, out of school networking for you.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, and I believe is the other city Phoenix? Is that right?
Yes, I knew I had it in my mind in the Southwest, so yes.
Right, got it. Well, thanks. That was really helpful, and this entire conversation was extremely helpful. I'm looking forward, as someone who is working with a group that's considering applying, going through and re-listening to your responses. So
yes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Good luck to everybody. I hope to see lots of great applications, and hope everybody feels inspired to apply.
Thanks. And so let me just close out by saying to our audience, if you're interested in learning more about connected learning, please make sure to check out the Connected Learning Alliance at clalliance.org, where there are tremendous testimonials from practitioners and informative multimedia pieces about their work. And if you'd like to keep abreast of future opportunities at Educator Innovator from partners like HASTAC and the Connected Learning Alliance, please sign up for our monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org. and follow us on Twitter at innovates_ed. Thanks, everyone, and thank you again, Cheryl.
Thanks, Paul.